So we are starting chapter 10, the Sod Busters. We're going to learn what that name even means and how it relates to those early settlers to Minnesota. So let's look at these key terms that we have. We're going to learn about subsistence farming, the Homestead Act, land speculators, market, diversified farming, the Grange, cooperative, and regulate. So those are key terms for this chapter. For our introduction, we see on the comprehension page, our first question, why were new settlers choosing to move to Minnesota in the years following the Civil War and the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862? We have some good guesses on why they are coming to Minnesota because we've been, learning about Minnesota at this time. But let's not fill in answers until we actually get them from the book. So we don't want guesses about why people would come to Minnesota. We want to take actually from the book to make sure we're putting down the correct information. So listen carefully. This whole page, we're going to be hearing different reasons why settlers might be coming to Minnesota.
By the mid-1860s, Minnesota was emerging from turbulent times. Two major conflicts, the Civil War and the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, had ended. Attention was returning to immigration and settlement. A new wave of settlers was pushing into Minnesota. These newcomers were lured by the promise of abundant, productive, and cheap land. They were a wide mix of people. Americans from other parts of the United States, as well as Canadians, Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, Irish, and English. Many of them were poor and had never owned a home. They saw Minnesota as a land of opportunity where they could make a living, raise a family, and be successful. Most of these newcomers believed the state was headed toward a time of peace and prosperity, or good fortune. This prosperity was based largely on agriculture. Southern and western Minnesota appeared to be superb farming country. The land was relatively flat. Its rich soil could support many kinds of crops. It had just about everything going for it, except that it hadn't been broken yet. Before settlers could plant any crops, they would have to cut through the sod to get to the rich soil underneath.
So, we heard several different things about why settlers are coming to Minnesota. Then it starts talking about, look at southwestern Minnesota. If you go west towards the Dakotas, if you go down south towards Iowa, do we see lots of mountains when we drive in those directions? No, we don't see mountains. What do we see a lot of? Prairies. We see a lot of open areas. We see a lot of farms, right? Back when these settlers were first coming, there weren't the farms there yet. It was all prairie land. Now, think about what prairie land looks like. If it hasn't been farmed yet, these are the grasses that have been growing there while the Dakota were living there for thousands of years. Think about the root system that these grasses have. They're pretty thick. When I go out into my garden and I'm weeding, some of the weeds have really thick roots to them, and I have to really work to pull them out. This is field upon field of these prairie grasses that have been growing for thousands of years. Their roots are really tight into the ground, and they're all interwoven among each other. So it's not easy. You don't just pull up the grass and, I can plant my field, I can plant my new crops, I can build my house. It's not easy when it's been there for thousands of years, right? So when it says it's unbroken ground, it's because nobody has dug up all of those grasses to do anything with that soil that's underneath of it.
Tall grasses covered the unbroken prairie land. These grasses had a heavy tangle of roots called sod. For thousands of years, the sod had fed plants that gave food and shelter to insects, birds, and animals. Those, in turn, had made life possible for people. The thick sod also protected the soil beneath it and stored water during dry seasons. It was the soil underneath the sod that held such promise for farming.
So think about the buffalo that the Dakota would follow. Okay, think about the wildlife that fed on those grasses. So the people needed the animals that fed on the grasses. But now times are changing. It's not just the Dakota living here. Now we have all these settlers coming in. They're wanting to set up farms, and underneath all of those grasses is the rich soil. That's so good for farming, because there's all these nutrients in that soil. But they have to be able to get down into that soil. They have to be able to tear up all those grasses with all of those roots that have been there for thousands of years. So, starting small in Lincoln County and changes on the farm. Two different sections. This first section, we're going to learn about subsistence farming. And in that second section, changes on the farm, we're going to learn about diversified farming. So in the boxes, you need to explain what is subsistence farming? What is diversified farming? You're going to describe them so you can see the difference in each type of farming. So as we listen to this first part, we're going to be listening for that subsistence farming. We're going to learn, we saw in that video that we saw at the beginning of the clip, that the picture of Mary Tainter and her family. We're going to be kind of following them on their journey in getting settled here in Minnesota. So we're going to learn a little more about the Tainters.
Starting small in Lincoln County. In September 1878, a covered wagon pulled by a team of oxen came to a stop on a wide stretch of prairie. The man at the reins, John Tainter, could tell this was the right place. He and his wife Sarah had claimed 80 acres of this land the previous spring. John looked to his wife and smiled. "Well, we've got home," he said. Sarah gazed over the landscape. All she saw was tall grass rippling in the breeze. There were no houses to be seen, no trees. This was her new home? She burst into tears. Then she wiped her eyes, climbed down from the wagon, and set foot for the first time on Lincoln County soil.
So, 80 acres. My house in my neighborhood my yard is a half an acre. Okay, some people have a quarter of an acre, some people have a full acre. So think about your neighborhood, how close the houses are. Think about maybe half an acre that your yard is. They had 80 acres. So think of how much land that is. There's other land that other people are buying, 80 acres, 100 acres. So think about how spread out these farmers are going to be. So John and Sarah get to this land. John's all excited. He's smiling. Home. This is ours. We finally have land that's ours. How does Sarah react? She cries. Why do you think she cried? Why would she be crying? John's smiling. Why is Sarah crying? I only have one person who has a guess. Why do you think Sarah might be crying? Aiden? I don't know if waste would be the right word, because they're finally getting land that's all their own. So I'm not sure that she necessarily thinks it was a waste, but what else might she be thinking? There's nothing here. What am I gonna do? There is literally nothing here except all this grass. John says we're home. Where's my home? Where's my house? There's no house. There's no farm. There's no garden. What are we gonna eat? Oh my goodness. 80 acres and I don't have a neighbor that I can go over and sit with and help me and talk to. There's nobody here for us. I have nothing. Woo. This is scary, right? But then what does Sarah do? Does she say, let's go back? Does she refuse to get out of the wagon? What does she do? I don't know.
She knows that she can't do anything about it, so she just steps out and is probably going to try to make the best of it.
She wipes her tears, gets down off of the wagon, says, let's go. Let's do it. This isn't ideal, right? This is going to be hard. But we gotta start somewhere. Let's get started. So she had her little moment of pity, right? I got a little pity party that, oh my goodness, this is gonna be awful. And then she takes a breath, says, we can do it. We've got this. And her and John get started on making this their home. Not a home yet, but they're gonna make it their home.
So what? What does your county do? The Tainter family chose to start a farm in Lincoln County, which had been established in 1873. The county was named for President Abraham Lincoln. The Minnesota legislature, which set up the county, wanted to name a county in his honor. No matter where you are in Minnesota, you live in a county. There are 87 of them. Even federal American Indian reservations, which have their own governments, exist within county lines. Counties are geographic areas that are subsections of states. States have the power to create smaller units of government, such as cities and counties. Each state has a slightly different system for setting up counties. In fact, only 48 states even use the word county. Alaska divides its governmental units into boroughs, and Louisiana uses the term parishes. Usually, counties have some independent governmental authority. The size of a county's government and the services it provides to its residents can vary. All counties have a county seat. This is the city or town where the county government is centered. Today, Lincoln County has approximately 20 government departments, and the county seat is Ivanhoe. Services provided by its departments include managing emergency response systems, maintaining parks, determining property values, developing business opportunities, and working with the state on elections. In which county do you live? Find out what services your county provides.
So I live in Coon Rapids. That is a part of Anoka County. Minneapolis and the suburbs that are closer to Minneapolis are part of Hennepin County. St. Paul and the suburbs that are close to St. Paul are Ramsey County. So depending on which city you live in, it tells you which county you live in. Most people that go to St. Vincent's live in a city that's in Hennepin County. You might live a little bit farther out like I do and be in Anoka County or another neighboring county. But majority of you are living in Hennepin County because we are in suburbs of Minneapolis. All right, so a little bit more about the Tainters.
The Tainters had come to this place with their 3 children in order to start a new life. Their first job was to put a roof over their heads. The next morning, John set off for Canby, the nearest town, 18 miles away. He came back with some lumber, and the family got to work. A few days later, the Tainters moved into a small shanty, or cabin, that would be their home for years to come. Like the Tainters, most farmers built houses out of wood. If they couldn't afford to buy boards from lumber mills, they had to use materials that were easy to find. If there were woods nearby, they could cut logs for a cabin. On the treeless prairies covering parts of Minnesota, settlers often built their first house from blocks of sod.
So think about what the land was like. Back then, they didn't have electricity, so they couldn't use electric saws, they couldn't use nail guns. They had to use just their own arm muscles to cut down the wood, to put it all together, nail it all together. If you had a little bit of money, you could go into town and get the lumber from the town. But some people didn't have enough money for that, so they had to cut up, we were talking about the root system of the grasses was so tight and packed together, they cut out blocks of that sod, and they used it like bricks to build their house. So think about what that house would be like if it was made out of sod. Think about all the dirt that's mixed in with it. It's all packed together, but that dust is gonna get over everything else. It's not ideal, but it's enough to protect the family from the elements. They don't have to worry about the rain because they're safe inside. They don't have to worry about the wild animals getting at their stuff because they're able to be inside the house. And as they get more established and more settled, they can build a better house made out of wood instead of out of the sod. But sometimes they had to use what was there because that's all they could afford.
Struggles and good times. Years later, the Tainters and other early settlers told stories about life on the prairie during those early years.
Sorry.
They were More settlers arrive. The Tainters were not the first settlers to move to Lincoln County, nor were they the last. The government had surveyed the county and opened it up for settlement in 1871. Land surveys measured and mapped boundaries of sections of land so that sections could be identified and sold. People had been staking claims there ever since the surveys were complete. By 1878, when the Tainters arrived, several hundred families were already living there.
So there's several hundred families there, but are they close together like our neighborhoods? No, because remember, the Tainters got 80 acres. They're spread out over all that land. The county's a big area, and then in that county, there's all those acres of land that's spread out. So even though there's other people there, they're not right next door. You're not just gonna hop on over and knock and say, hey, I'm trying to make some eggs and I need another egg. Do you got an egg I can borrow? Right? It's a distance to get to the neighbor's houses.
At first, the Tainters and other early settlers in Lincoln County practiced subsistence farming, producing just enough food to feed themselves and trade with neighbors. Typically during their first year, Lincoln County farmers broke sod on a few acres and planted crops such as potatoes, turnips, and corn. Sometimes they planted wheat, but usually it was just enough to make flour for their own use. The nearest grist mill for grinding the grain into flour was 35 miles away. Even if local farmers did produce extra grain, they had no easy, reliable way to bring it to market.
So the Tainters have 80 acres of land. That land isn't ready and able for them to plant crops all over it. They have to prepare the land. So they need to be able to break up all that sod busting. It's how we got the name for our chapter. They have to break up all that sod to make the land ready to build a house, to make the land ready to get a barn, to make the land ready for their crops. So the first few years, they just do subsistence farming because they're taking care of their needs. Need number one, shelter. We need a house to live in, to protect us, to protect our stuff. Need number two, we need food for us to live, for us to survive the winter. We need to grow crops that we can save So we have it in the middle of winter when the blizzards come, right? So they are just growing enough for themselves. That's subsistence farming. Just growing what we need to take care of ourselves, maybe trade a little bit with a neighbor. Not enough where we're gonna sell and make a profit. Subsistence farming is just enough for us to survive on. So that's that first box, subsistence farming. Farming with just enough crops that we can use to eat, not with the intention of selling anything. Yeah, you can write the definition, sure. So that definition of subsistence farming.
Subsistence farming. The practice of producing enough food to feed one's own family, but not enough to sell at market.
That would be a description of subsistence farming, definitely.
Struggles and good times. Years later, the Tainters and other early settlers told stories about life on the prairie during those early years. They recalled their struggles to keep their families fed, and the 4 summers in a row during the 1870s when enormous clouds of grasshoppers blocked the sun and destroyed crops. They remembered the incredibly long and harsh winter of 1880 to 1881. That winter, settlers tied ropes to their houses and themselves before venturing outside so they could find their way back home in the deep snow.
So there were struggles. It wasn't easy. So we saw in that video at the beginning of the chapter about the grasshoppers coming and the swarms of grasshoppers that just filled the sky. Well, the grasshoppers didn't stay in the sky. They would land and cover everything. They would eat the crops. They'd cover their houses. You'd go outside to walk and you're stepping on grasshoppers. So they had that for several years. That's in the summertime. Wintertime, the winter of 1880, huge blizzards. Huge blizzards. Okay, this winter, we had a little snow, not a lot. Last winter, we had even less snow. The winter before that, we had piles and piles of snow. So Minnesota, kind of hit or miss. You don't know what your winter's going to be like. Back in 1880, that's when the big blizzards were happening. They had to tie ropes just to go from their house to the outhouse so they wouldn't get lost trying to get back to their house. It was a lot. So it was a struggle. Is life always bad? Now, they wouldn't stay if life was always bad, if life was just miserable. You make the best out of your situation, and you can have fun with it. Let's hear some of the things that they did.
They also told stories about good times. During the winters, children had fun sliding down snow-covered rooftops. Simple joys filled holiday celebrations when family members gave each other pincushions and toys made in secret from scraps of cloth, corn husks, or other available materials.
So look at their house. It's a pretty small house, right? That roof isn't too high up, but it's slanted. And if they have so much snow, all these blizzards hit, think about what fun it would be to go sledding down that rooftop. Ooh, that would be fun. I know my house is on a little bit of a hill and we have a kind of a steep driveway. My kids would love going sledding down our driveway into the cul-de-sac, right? You make your fun. So yeah, it was hard. Life was not easy for them, but they could make their own fun. Find the joy in the little things. Yeah, we've got another snowstorm. Ooh, let's go sledding now. Okay, so making their own fun. Otherwise, they wouldn't stay. They would have moved back. So that changes on the farm is still that same section. We are going to be getting to that diversified farming. So we learned about subsistence farming. We will be learning about diversified farming.
Changes on the farm. The experiences of the Tainters were similar to those of other early settlers in Minnesota. In addition to land, farm families also needed a house, a barn, fences, tools, animals, seed, and many more things. All of these cost money. Even with inexpensive land, farmers often had to borrow money to get started. They needed plows, axes, spades, pitchforks, pots and pans, stoves, needles, thread, and all sorts of other tools and household goods. Without these things, farm families could not start work. Most farmers also owned a team of oxen. Oxen were slower than horses, but they could pull heavier loads and machinery like plows. Many families also had a cow or two and a few chickens or pigs.
So they get there, they're able to buy 80 acres of land. Woo, we can actually own land, but they need all this other stuff. They can't bring all these materials with them in their wagon coming across all the land. They don't have all the tools that they need. So they need to be able to buy the things to set up their land, to set up their house. So how did they get this land? So the Homestead Act helps us know one way that they were able to get a homestead, to get the land. So we're gonna go down to that sidebar of land, how to get it, and we're gonna listen for 4 ways that they were able to get the land. So the teachers got 80 acres of land. How? Okay, let's see how they were able to.
Land. How to get it. European American settlers who needed land had several ways of getting it. The Homestead Act of 1862 provided one important way. This was a federal law that had a huge impact on many states, including Minnesota. A homestead was a section of public land up to 160 acres. After citizens had lived on a homestead for 5 years, built a house, and cultivated its soil, then the government sold them the property for an incredibly low price. To be recorded as the official owner, they had to pay a registration fee of just $18. The Homestead Act was not the only way settlers got land. Some bought it from railroad companies who had received it from the federal government. Others settled on government-owned land without permission and eventually bought it from the government. Still more took advantage of government programs that offered free land to soldiers.
So we have the Homestead Act, that's one way, and it explains what that Homestead Act means. They had to live there for, I think it was 5 years, it said. Yep, 5 years, build a house, get the soil ready and planted. So they had to tear up all that sod and plant it. They could get up to 160 acres. So that Homestead Act was one way that they got the homestead, that they got land. The next paragraph tells us 3 more ways that they got land. So you need to put all 4 ways in there. Did that answer your question, Robbie? Eleanor?
Could we just write the Homestead Act?
Well, the question says, name 4 ways a farmer could get a homestead. So if you just put the Homestead Act, which is one way, is that answering the whole question? Well, what does the question say, Eleanor? So the Homestead Act, I said, is one way. Is that fully answering the question? Is that 4 ways?
No.
It's one way. So if you just put the Homestead Act, are you going to get full credit for that question? You need to list all 4. So you don't have to explain everything about the Homestead Act. You can say they used the Homestead Act, that's one way. Put the other 3 ways from the other paragraph. Now, this last section is about the land speculators. That's Louis Fertile. There is a town in Minnesota called Fertile, Minnesota, named after him. We're going to hear what he did with the land.
Not everyone who obtained land in these ways actually intended to live on it or farm it. Many people wanted the land only so they could sell it to somebody else and make a profit. These people were called land speculators, and they often made a great deal of money by guessing which pieces of land settlers would want to buy. Consider the case of Louis Fertile, a land speculator in Lincoln County. Records show that Fertile once paid the government $8 for 160 acres. 10 days later, he sold those same 160 acres for $1,200. That's $1,192 in profit. Not all speculators were as lucky as Louis Fertile, though. Many lost their life savings by guessing wrong about how much money they could make on a land sale.
So, Fertile was able to say, okay, I'm going to spend $8 and get 160 acres of land, and I want to sell that land for profit. So, there's all this land to choose from. Do I want to choose this land over here that has all these woods on it? Why might that not be a good idea? Eleanor?
Because if you went up and around and up and house or
Because he wants to be able to sell it. Who's he going to sell to? Farmers. Farmers want to build a house. Farmers want to have a space for them to plant their crops. Do they want to chop down all of the woods? No, that's too much work. This land over here has a stream running through it with running water. Do you think that might be good land to buy? Yeah, because farmers want that water to be able to water their crops. I'm gonna buy this land. They're both $8, 160 acres over here with, some of the farmers coming in might not want that land, or 160 acres over here with a stream going through it. I'm gonna make the smart choice and buy the land that I'm gonna be able to sell. And I'm gonna be able to sell at a profit. So then word gets out, oh my goodness, did you hear what my friend Louis did? He paid $8 and sold it for $1,200. That's a huge profit. Now, $1,200 sounds like a good amount of money to me. That's pretty nice. Back then, that was like $100,000, right? There's inflation. Back in the 1880s, that was a ton of money. Well, if Louis can do it, I can do it. I'm gonna try to find some land, buy it cheap and sell it expensive. Is everybody gonna be as lucky as Louis? No. It's a gamble. You're taking a risk when you buy something and want to sell it for more, because you need people to want to buy it at that higher price. Louis got lucky. A lot of other land speculators are like, well, I wanna make some easy money, buy cheap, sell expensive. Not everybody found the right land that people would want to buy for that expensive price. So people went into debt because they thought they could turn a good profit like Louis did, but they can't. So it's very risky. Sometimes it pays off big, sometimes you go into debt. No, we've learned that had the 3 ways that you could get land. So we talked about the Homestead Act, and then there were the 3 ways I said in this paragraph. So Homestead Act was 1, we need 4, so there's 3 more ways. We got it. I just didn't highlight it all because I can't give you all the answers, right? So you gotta go, oh, yep, this is what that paragraph was telling us. Okay. So you should have number 1 answered, subsistence farming for number 2, number 3, and number 4 answered. Okay, we're gonna stop there. We don't have class tomorrow since it's day 1. We will pick it up on Thursday for day 2. Okay, so we will read some more on day 2. If you are listening at home, I hope you are well. I hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day.